Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin the year 2023, we know that this year is going to be a very eventful year. And as we've done since we began our broadcasting in May of 2020, each year we've sounded a particular note that we feel is important for us to take into deep consideration. And as we begin 2023, we want to sound the note of war and peace, because I think, as all of us know, what's happening right now in Ukraine is exceedingly dangerous. In all likelihood, the most dangerous moment in our lifetime. And if we do not stop the war, it's also very likely that we'll have some kind of nuclear exchange. So we began yesterday with an overview of the situation over there, with an emphasis with Jody Evans, who's the founder of Code Pink, who's been working tireless to bring peace to the world since the Iraq War 20 years ago. And now Code Pink and a growing coalition of groups in the United States, in Europe, and around the world are beginning to focus on the singular demand that we need a ceasefire in Ukraine, and we need diplomacy rather than war to begin an era of peace. So today I'm going to continue that discussion in the spirit of a teach-in, which we did during the Vietnam War. But before we dive into that domain, let us just pause, as we always do at the beginning of our Humanity Rising sessions, and let us just simply breathe together in a spirit of compassion, in a spirit of coherence, in a spirit of deep yearning for the kind of world that we all know is possible, but is not yet available to us at this time. You'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear that bell, just breathe in for about 5.5 seconds. When you hear the second bell, just breathe out. And we'll take 10 breaths together as we begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to breathe as one and know that whatever happens, humanity will rise one way or another, whatever the adversity, whatever the challenges, whatever the obstructions. Our major challenge as we enter the year 2023 is the reality that the most critical issue is increasing ecological turbulence and runaway climate change that has now become climate disaster everywhere around the world. In order to solve that problem, the world needs to come together and act in a unified way to lower emissions, to regenerate the ecology, to attune ourselves as the human species with the larger ecological order in the recognition that we are nature. We're children of Mother Earth, and we have a mission to curate this beautiful, precious planet for future generations yet unborn. What are we doing? We're going to war. We're in a global situation, not of cooperation, but of hostility, not of focus on how we ameliorate climate disaster, but how we destroy infrastructure, economies, cause mass migration of people as refugees. And we're doing it with such alacrity that the real issues are being sidelined, which does not mean that they're going away. So as I've said multiple times, and I want to reiterate it now, fomenting war between the two greatest powers on earth, America and Russia, at the moment when they should be cooperating fully on stabilizing the global ecology, is a recipe for suicide. There's a real possibility, and I hope everybody takes this in, that if the war in Ukraine continues as it is in an accelerated way, the human race will destroy the very capacity we urgently need to solve critical global issues, primarily a destabilizing ecology. And that's why I have begun this new year with a focus on Ukraine. To me, it's not a issue, it's the issue. And understanding it, understanding the pathway to war and understanding the pathway to peace is of singular importance to our Humanity Rising community. So what I would like to do over the next hour is to just provide a teach-in. As you know, I'm the president of a university. I am a professor of world history and world religions and philosophy. So I teach a lot, and I love the professorial modality. As I said yesterday, always in the spirit of Socratic dialogue, always in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. We're all blind people trying to figure out what this elephant in the room is. We all have different perspectives. And I want to honor that many of you have very passionate opinions about what's going on in Ukraine. Many of you hate the Russians. Many of you consider Vladimir Posner a diabolical figure, an autocrat, a warmonger, and you're supporting the US effort and the Ukrainian troops as they fight the Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine. I completely understand that. For the last 75 years, the United States and then the Soviet Union and now Russia have been enemies. And we need to understand that that enemy formation is very deep in the psyche of the Western mind, particularly Americans. So I ask all you Americans in particular to really think about why you hate Russia, why you have an adversarial relationship with Vladimir Putin, and consider that this is a construct of the mass media. One of the experiences that I had back in 1982, when I first went to the Soviet Union, it was in September of 1982. I had just done a PhD dissertation on the moral implications of nuclear weapons. And I talked about my dissertation and my thesis with everyone that I could, just to learn and get responses so I could refine my messaging, because this was a PhD and I wanted to get it exactly right. And what I noticed was that virtually without exception, there were one or two, but very few. When I would talk about nuclear weapons, everybody would say, well, of course we need nuclear weapons because of the Soviet threat. And I was a little stunned by that, because nuclear weapons are sui generis. They mean the destruction of everything, as we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everything was destroyed. And yet what had been built up in the American mind and in the Western mind was that the Soviets were so evil that we needed to be able to completely destroy the earth in order to feel secure. And I had an extraordinary experience the first time that I went to the Soviet Union. We flew into Moscow. And as the plane descended toward the airport, and I began to see the contours of the land, I began to realize that I was terrified to be landing in the Soviet Union. And I expected to see police with machine guns and the Gulag archipelago and people terrorized, and I didn't know what I expected. But I realized in that instance that my own psyche had been conditioned by the mass media about the Soviet Union. And I can still remember walking into the airport, into passport control, and looking around and realizing I was like in this police state. What is a police state like? How am I going to be treated? Am I going to be safe? And when I began to experience the Russian people as some of the friendliest people that I'd ever met, it took me some time to really understand the depth to which the animosity against the Soviet Union and against Russia was ingrained in my own psyche. So I wanted to start with this as we begin our teach-in, so that those of you who believe that the war in Ukraine was an unprovoked aggression by the Russians and that Vladimir Putin has delusions of grandeur around a greater Russia and was invading Ukraine in order to take it back, I hope that for just a few minutes, you can set that aside and entertain another view of the elephant that might be more accurate because it's looking at the elephant from a larger whole. Remember, that's the key to the metaphor of the blind people and the elephant. If you're just looking at the trunk, or you're just looking at the ears, or you're just looking at the feet, that's all you see. But if you can somehow let go of that focus on the particular and go back far enough to see the whole elephant, you see it all. Or at least you see most of it. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, is to step way back into history, into geostrategic relations, to seek to understand how we got to the present moment. And understanding that, then propose a pathway to peace. But it's not until we understand the whole that the parts then come into a relationship in which everything fits together. And that is what we're going to try to do today. And as we do our first summit between the 27th of February and the 3rd of March, which was right around the first anniversary of the invasion last year on the 24th of February, we're going to be doing it from the point of view of looking at the whole. So let's begin by looking at the map. And that is key to understanding what's really happening. This is Ukraine. It's the biggest country in Europe. It's the breadbasket of Europe. It's had an extraordinary history, but it never became an independent country until just about 30 years ago in 1991. So it's newly formed. It's had a very complex history, that entire region. What I want to focus our attention on right now is what the Russians actually did. This is Russia up here. This is Ukraine. What the Russians have done is come in and secure a land bridge to Crimea. This is Sevastopol. That's where the Russians have had a fleet since 1783 and the Empress Catherine the Great. So Russia has controlled this territory for the last 250 years until very, very recently. So this is historic Russian land. We'll get into that more deeply. And so what the Russians have done is secure the land bridge. They have not invaded Ukraine. They have not gone into Eastern Europe to take anything over. They have simply secured a land bridge down to the Black Sea. And Black Sea empties out into the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean then goes to the Atlantic. And if you understand this map and the singular fact that this was not an unprovoked invasion to take over Ukraine, but a very intentional reclaiming of ancient Russian land, you understand the essence of what's going on. And you also understand that Russia is not going to give this up. And Putin has said that he will defend what they've taken with nuclear weapons if necessary. So everybody just needs to take this in. This map is not going to change. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how did that happen? How did it come about that last February, the Russians seized the land bridge to Crimea and have said that they're not going to give this up under any circumstances. In order to understand that, we need to go back to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. You remember in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down and everybody was jubilant. And like the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, everybody was shocked. Nobody expected the Berlin Wall to come down, just like nobody expected the Russians to invade eastern and southern Ukraine to secure that land bridge to Crimea. Everybody was shocked. It was what they call a black swan event. 9/11 was a black swan event. The financial crash of 2008 was a black swan event. Most events are black swan events because most of the time people aren't paying any attention to what is accumulating in the historical process. So when something dramatic happens, like the collapse of the Berlin Wall, everybody's surprised, and history then proceeds. But the Berlin Wall did not come down for no reason. The Berlin Wall came down as part of a much larger agreement that was being fashioned between Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and President Bush Sr., Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, and Chancellor Helmut Kohl in West Germany at the time, around the ending of the Cold War. And I think it's just important, just parenthetically, to say that this is something that I actually know a lot about. I don't know a lot about very much, but there's some things I know a lot about. And what I know a lot about is that time, because during that time, I was working in the whole field of citizen diplomacy. And I was working with the Central Committee in the Soviet Union. I was working with the Politburo of the Soviet Union. I knew Alexander Yakovlev, who was the head of ideology of the Soviet Union, of the Politburo. He was the one that had brought in Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Minister of Agriculture in the government, and Edward Shevardnadze, who had been down in Georgia. And he cultivated them. And then when the old guard of Brezhnev and Chernenko and Andropov died away, Alexander Yakovlev brought Gorbachev in to be general secretary, Edward Shevardnadze to be a foreign minister. And I had the great privilege, it's one of the great privileges of my whole life, to be in the Soviet Union. I had an apartment in Moscow. I must have made 75 or 100 trips to Moscow from San Francisco and from Europe. I had just done my doctoral dissertation on the nuclear issue. I was fascinated. So starting in 1982, I was traveling all over the Soviet Union, spent a lot of time in Ukraine. In fact, I went to the University of Ukraine there in Kiev for a number of months studying Russian and picked up a little bit of Ukrainian. I brought Boris Yeltsin, who was the man who overthrew Gorbachev, to the United States and presided actually with the experience that he had that led to him wanting to overthrow the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So I was intimately involved with the Soviet Union and the Soviet leadership during that time. I was the last foreigner to be received by Gorbachev in his Kremlin office before he resigned. I was standing by Edward Shevardnadze when he closed the doors of the Soviet Union foreign ministry as the Russian Federation took over. So it was an extraordinary moment in my life to be there up close and personal, as they say, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And the point that I want to make is that the proposal that Gorbachev made initially to Reagan, but then also to Bush and Thatcher and Kohl, he says the Cold War has become dysfunctional. There's no reason for us to have nuclear weapons pointing at each other in sufficient quantities to destroy the world. What we need to do is understand that we're not enemies anymore. Gorbachev was a democratic socialist. That was what glasnost and perestroika were all about. He wanted peace, and his proposal was that the Soviet Union would withdraw from Eastern Europe. And here I want to show another map. Another map. See, at that time, the Soviet Union had taken over Eastern Europe, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Why had it done that? At the end of World War II, after the Germans had gone into Russia to destroy Russia and had killed upwards of 27 million Russians, the Soviet Union pushed back as the United States landed in Normandy here. The US and Britain fought the Germans from the west, and from the south, from North Africa, came up through Italy. The Soviet Union pushed west from the east, and that led to the division of Germany. And that agreement was codified in 1945 in Yalta when Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin met. The Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany was draconian. It was repressive. There were many revolts against the Soviets. It was under Andropov that the Soviet Union went down into Afghanistan, and it was Gorbachev that withdrew the Soviet forces from Afghanistan. And he understood that that situation could not long endure, that the Soviet Union needed to withdraw from Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans needed to be free because Germany was no longer a threat. So what he proposed to the West was that the Soviet Union would withdraw from all these countries, allow West Germany and East Germany to be reunited. If the United States and NATO would not move an inch to the east and allow the Eastern European countries to just fashion their own way, but that the greatest opportunity, said Gorbachev, is to create a common economic and security zone that would encompass Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. Gorbachev saw his vision was a common economic and security zone from Gibraltar all the way to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, where the Soviet Union ended. And Gorbachev thought that there was general agreement that that was what was going to be the meta direction that history would take place. And so in good faith, he withdrew from Eastern Europe. Germany was reunited. And the United States, having made bold public proclamations of agreement with that, broke that fundamental agreement. And that's really important for everybody to understand as we look at the elephant rather than the part, that the genesis of what has now concluded in a war in Ukraine began with the vision by the Russians of a greater peace and a violation of that by the Americans and by NATO. Because what happened by 2015 is that rather than honoring that agreement and working with Russia to create a global security and economic zone, the United States, beginning in 1999 under President Clinton, first taking Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and then under President George Bush Jr. in 2004, taking Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Croatia, Slovakia. NATO pushed to the east. And rather than working with Russia, continued the Cold War mentality of understanding Russia as the enemy, even though following Gorbachev's line, Yeltsin and Putin, when he came to power in the year 2000 as the successor of Yeltsin and as president of Russia, said all they wanted with the West was a partnership. And both Yeltsin and Putin offered that it was conceivable that the Russians should join NATO and join the European Union. They wanted that common security zone. They weren't enemies anymore. They were capitalists. So why does NATO have to push to the east? Why does the United States need to bring nuclear weapons, military forces, and an aggressive posture when what the Russians wanted was a partnership because everybody was capitalists now? It's an extraordinary situation. Then in 2008, here's another map we need to see. In May of 2008, again under President Bush Jr., who was in the thrall and under the control of the neoconservatives. This is all about the impulse of the neoconservatives in the United States to use the unipolar moment when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, not as an opportunity for peace, but as an opportunity for military expansion and invasions, whether it was Iraq, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was Libya, whether it was the Balkans, Syria. The United States was on the path to use the unipolar moment to consolidate military control over Europe and eventually the breakup of Russia. And you can see maps from those times. Regime change. How many times have you heard about regime change in Russia? And the Russians understand that. So in 2008, when the United States, over the objections of the French and the Germans, who understood what was now going to happen, NATO declared that the next acquisitions were going to be to take Ukraine and also take Georgia. That's when Putin and the foreign minister Lavrov said, this is now a red line. This is an existential threat. You have the Baltics up here with the border to Russia. And it's just important to know that the United States has troops there, as it does throughout all of NATO. And these troops right on the Russian border, as of last December, have gone from defensive modality to offensive modality and ready for immediate action. So now you have the United States wanting to nuclearize and expand NATO to the east and there's a 1,200-kilometer border with Russia. Here's Moscow. There's Georgia. And Putin and Lavrov said, no way. That's a red line. And Putin said then, back in 2008, if you insist on militarizing Ukraine, we'll retake Crimea. And if I'm remembering the map, what they've done since last year is secure, this is Russia, they've secured the land bridge to Crimea, which they have to have, Russia as a great power, in order to get into the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and out to the Atlantic. One of the first things that Putin did was go down into Georgia. He did that in the fall of 2008 in a military incursion. Troops and tanks went into the capital city of Tbilisi, and he said to the government in Georgia, you are not going to join NATO. It's not going to happen. He said the same thing to Ukraine. Things were tense from 2008 to 2014. You've heard of the Maidan Revolution, which was essentially a coup that was orchestrated by the United States to replace a pro-neutral, pro-Russian leader, Yanukovych, in Ukraine with a pro-Western, pro-US, virulently anti-Russian regime. Putin then took Crimea, just as he said he would. And the Ukrainian government, beginning in 2015, outlawed the Russian language, outlawed teaching Russian into schools, outlawed Russian culture, and began artillery barrages in the eastern Ukraine or in the Donbass, which is 80% Russia, and altogether about 14,000 people were killed. And one of the tensions there was that the Russians began to support the Russian communities in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine, which has historically been Russia. And that led to increasing tensions. And then that broke out into the war and the invasion last year, when it was clear that US troops were now beginning to enter Ukraine, NATO troops, Western mercenaries, and that the United States had no intent of creating a pathway to peace. They were intent on taking Ukraine, and Putin said, this is not going to happen. And if necessary, I will destroy Ukraine. That's what the bombing of Ukraine it means right now. They've taken what they're going to take, and that's not going to change. And as long as Ukraine continues the war, the Russians are going to bomb it to smithereens. And we all need to know that. And that's why this situation is so dangerous. Because you've got the irresistible force of NATO expansion, as you see. This is the elephant, ladies and gentlemen. The irresistible force of NATO-US expansion meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism. And both sides are heavily nuclear armed. And the US has just allocated over $112 billion for Ukraine, because the United States is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, possibly reinforced with US troops, backed up by nuclear weapons. The Russians are now putting into this area hundreds of thousands of more troops. So you need to go back to this map for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops now are massed here. And it's all likely, as we stand here on the 10th of January, that over the next couple of months, there's going to be major Russian offensives against the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have lost over 120,000 troops. The Russians have lost about 15,000. The kill ratio, as they call it in military terminology, is there's about 8 or 9 Ukrainians killed for every one Russian. And there's been several million Ukrainians made refugees that have gone up into Poland, into Moldova, into Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, even in Germany. So the escalation of this war a year on is getting into serious territory, seriously dangerous territory, as the irresistible force of the US expansion and militarism meets the immovable object of Russian nationalism. So the question that we need to ask ourselves as we understand the immovable object of Russia is why the Russians are drawing the line at Ukraine. They complained when the United States took the rest of Eastern Europe, but they didn't do anything about it, in part because they were too weak. But when it came to Georgia and Ukraine, they're saying no more. This is not going to happen, and we'll go to nuclear war to stop you. Very important for people to take this in. This is the elephant. Now, I'd like to take a few moments to go into history, because it's very important to understand why the Russians are so passionate about Ukraine. And I'm going to put up another map. Oops. There we go. Let's go back 1,000 years. 1,000 years to Kievan Rus. This is what Europe looked like in the mid-11th century, just about 1,000 years ago. In the 980s, or the 890s rather, in the 9th century, around Kiev, the kingdom of Rus was established when the Kievan princes went to Vladimir of Rus to the northeast, because they couldn't figure out how to govern themselves, and they wanted a strong man, and he came in, and they created Kievan Rus. So Russia began in Ukraine. It's very important for people to understand that. Russia is not distinct from Ukraine. Russia began in Ukraine, and it was called for many centuries Kievan Rus. And you can see here that that area, here's Crimea, and at that time it was controlled by the Byzantine Empire. But over the centuries, Kievan Rus was, then it was taken over by the Lithuanians, and it gradually migrated to the east and to the north and became Russia. Ukraine never existed as an independent nation. It was always part of something else, although it had its own distinct culture. And then in 1783, in the last sort of iteration under Catherine the Great, the Russians came back into this area and controlled all of Ukraine, Crimea, and this was Russia. This was all Russia till very, very recently, until the First World War. And then in the First World War, Lenin, out of the carnage of 10 million dead, and the Austro-Hungary Empire had been broken up, and Germany had been defeated, and Russia had been defeated, and the Tsar had been overthrown, and the Bolsheviks had taken over. This was a time of huge turbulence. One of the things that Lenin did, and then followed by Stalin, who were the first leaders of the Soviet Union, which began in 1918 in the aftermath, out of the ashes of the First World War, they created the Soviet Union. And they created Ukraine as a sort of a sovereign state, along with other nations, but all as part of the Soviet Union. All as part of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to go back to this map here. And as you see, when they created Ukraine, Russia still had this. But then in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, trying to tidy up the borders, said, well, why don't we just give all this to Ukraine? And Russia will be to the east. And Russia will have special rights to go into Crimea, which it had had for the last 250, 300 years. But because we're all, it's like in the United States, a boundary dispute between California and Arizona, say. If you're all part of the United States, you have more of a latitude to adjudicate boundaries and tidy things up because you're all part of the same union. So that was the logic under which Crimea was given to Ukraine in 1954. But then, of course, the Soviet Union itself broke up. And Ukraine still had that part of the world, but the Yeltsin and then Putin immediately became concerned that Russia had given up ancestral land in the spirit of friendship and eternal partnership. And that partnership and that union was no longer there. So all of a sudden, tensions began between Ukraine and Russia, mostly because it's been historically Russian. About 80% of the population here is Russia. So that's the situation in which we now find ourselves in Ukraine. And I will make a strong statement. We all talk about the historic right that the Jews have to Israel. They were in Israel, from about 1000 BC till about 2000 years ago. And about Moses and Joshua and David and Judah and Israel. That's the historic land of the Bible, of the Jews. And then when the Romans came and they had the insurrections about 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, as you may remember, and Jews were expelled. And that began the great diaspora of the Jews until 1948, out of the carnage and the Holocaust and all the extraordinarily barbaric things that were done to Jews in the spirit of anti-Semitism. The Jews went back to the Holy Land, to their ancestral land. And the world recognized that they had the right to do that. And it's created lots of tensions with the Palestinians, but the ancestral right of peoples to indigenous land is very strong in human culture. The Russians have the same right to Crimea and the land bridge that they've secured as the Jews have to Israel. And we all need to understand that. They haven't invaded a country like the United States, invaded Iraq. Iraq has nothing to do with the United States. It's on the other side of the planet. So in the ferociousness with which the Russians are securing that land bridge And the reason why it's the immovable object is because this is sacred land to them. This is ancestral lands. This is where Mother Russia began. And that's why the irresistible force of NATO expansion is meeting an immovable object of Russian nationalism and Russian ancestral patriotism. And they're not going to back down. And everybody needs to understand that. This war is not going to end with the Russians withdrawing. It's not going to happen. That's the elephant. So what we have to begin to think about is, how do we get out of this mess? What is the pathway to peace? The pathway to peace starts with the map. This is what Henry Kissinger said last May, I think, in Davos. He says the Russians are not going to give up what they've taken. We have to acknowledge that and go from there. So that's the point number one of any pathway to peace, is that the United States needs to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. I know this is probably hard for people to take, and it may not happen because the United States is so caught up in the neoconservative unipolar moment of supreme planetary control. But the peace movement needs to understand that we need a ceasefire. We need to stop the acceleration toward war. And we need a summit of all parties to begin to think through and discuss how to move forward out of this thicket that has been created by the eastward expansion of NATO in violation of that agreement back in 1989 and 1990 that the US and NATO would not move to the east. So we've had a fundamental violation of that agreement. We've had the Russians now drawing a red line. And we need to move now toward a peace process, or we're going to end up in a nuclear exchange. This is a Jean Monnet moment. This is a moment when, as has happened in Europe and in different places around the world, it happened in World War I, happened in World War II, where at a certain moment, an armistice is just simply declared. In World War I, it was on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. It's Armistice Day. And they said, we're just going to stop. Doesn't matter where you are, we're just going to stop. And wherever you are, those are basically the borders. We did that in Europe in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. That's how wars stop. They finally get to a point where they say, okay, you've taken X, I've taken Y, let's be done with it. The United States has taken all of Eastern Europe. That's enough. Russia now has taken its land bridge to Crimea. That's enough. Ukraine should still be a sovereign state. Because even though the Russians have taken that land bridge, 80% of Ukraine, which is still a new country, remain. And it should have its own access through Odessa to the Black Sea. So what does the United States get? It gets basically Eastern Europe. The United States basically controls Europe, economically, politically, and militarily. The Russians now have said, we're going to take this land bridge to Crimea. They keep that. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It gets its security of being sovereign for the first time ever in history. That's important. What is also possible, and this is at the heart of the proposal that I've been making in my blog and in my video, is that the real possibility is to see this as a Jean Monnet moment, and that out of the carnage of this war, Ukraine and the Russian territories form a larger Ukrainian union, which is exactly what the Germans and the French did at the end of the Second World War. They butchered each other. So 50 million people were dead as a result of the Second World War. Millions of Germans. Germany was completely destroyed. Most of France was completely destroyed. And Jean Monnet, a French diplomat, said, we got to stop this. And he proposed the oil and the coal and steel commission, whereby Germany and France and other countries, formerly enemies, would come together and create a union. Just imagine a ceasefire, a summit, and out of that, the construction of a larger Ukraine, honoring all the parties. Again, the US gets Eastern Europe, with the exception of Ukraine and Georgia. Russia gets its land bridge. Ukraine gets its independence and sovereignty. And there's a larger Ukraine, which is demilitarized, which is what essentially happened in the European Union. The countries put down their weapons. They kept reasonable forces. But for the last 75 years, Europe has not been at war, with the single exception of the Balkans in the 1990s. So that stability is what's possible. And one of the reasons why the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians to secure the land bridge to Crimea was such a shock is because Europe hadn't really known war since 1945. There had been, uprisings and, there's been the usual turbulence, but there hadn't been nation-to-nation war until last February. So we should be thinking about how we understand this elephant and how we can align the pieces now in a larger mosaic in which all the parties get essentially what they want. The US wants supreme mastery of Europe. Okay. The Russians need that land bridge. Okay. The Ukrainians want sovereignty. Okay. Now let's get on with building the peace. Because I believe that Gorbachev's proposal was sound. That the real challenge is for all the countries to come together. The United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, to create one common security and economic zone, again, from Gibraltar to Vladivostok. If that could happen, what an extraordinary world we would have. It would be the entry point to a global civilization built on peace and tolerance and mutuality. And in that spirit, I want to speak as an American as we begin to conclude. I believe that the aggressor here has been the United States. That's the elephant. This has not been about Russian aggression. This has been about Russia defending itself in a last stand against US and NATO expansionism. And I believe that we in the United States need to, at some point, come to terms with the fact that since 1989, the United States has forfeited the greatest strategic opportunity in modern history to create a global peace structure. Because instead of working with the Russians, we kept them as enemies and fomented aggression against the Russians. Even though the Russians repeatedly said, we're no longer communists, we should all be working together in partnership. And I realize this is probably difficult for most Americans to take in, that we're actually in the wrong. But as an American, I just want to say that I believe that the United States violated the greatest opportunity in modern history, and that's how we've ended up with Ukraine. At some point, the United States has got to stand down from ceaseless war. We have been in perpetual war since 1945. The United States has never been without some war somewhere, and it has to end. And I think Ukraine is that point where I think that the world is now beginning to understand that the world is better off without the supremacy of the United States, which has simply become a war machine. And I believe that the United States needs to stand down. I believe the United States needs to apologize. I believe the United States needs to embrace Russia, Ukraine, all of Europe in a completely new spirit in which amity, not enmity, holds sway, and commonality, not aggressiveness, is the tuning fork for how we shape the future. And the fact that the rest of the world is beginning to organize against the United States and starting to dismantle the supremacy of the US dollar, as we saw last November when Saudi Arabia announced that the sale of oil, the biggest commodity in the world, is no longer going to be traded exclusively in US dollars, but in multiple currencies. That will do more to erode the primacy of the United States than any military action that one can do against the United States. So we have a major movement of the tectonic plates. And so we don't have unlimited time to solve this thing, so that the central message here is that if you look at the elephant in the room, the irresistible force of NATO expansion is meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism, and nuclear war is increasingly likely day by day. We have to stop this war. We need a ceasefire. We need diplomacy. And eventually, the United States needs to stand down and embrace peace rather than perpetual war. And I say this as an American. So I think that'll conclude my remarks for today, everyone. I've spoken very passionately, as you've heard. I care very deeply about this. I love the Russians. The Russians taught me friendship. And I wish that we could just entertain the possibility, particularly Americans, that we could love the Russians like we're loving the Ukrainians and work with the Russians. Because the US-Russian relationship is the most important relationship in the world. It has sculpted the world since 1945, this great tension between these two great powers. If we could turn that into its opposite, and we could become partners, embracing each other, working together on climate change, working together to develop a common economic and security zone that would bring us all together. Wouldn't that be the world that we all want? And I believe it's a world worth striving for. But in order to start that process, we need a ceasefire and we need a summit. So I haven't had a chance to look at all the chats. So I can't, I don't know what the various questions have been. So if you have some immediate questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll try to comment as I can. I know a lot of you. I just noticed the dictatorial regime in Russia. There are many ways of governing. Democracy is one way, authoritarianism is another way, monarchy is another way. There's all kinds of ways that people over time in history have governed themselves. Russia at the moment is an authoritarian regime. The United States, I would say, is an authoritarian regime. We have what I call totalitarian democracy. We have elections between the Democrats and the Republicans, but it doesn't really make any difference, particularly in terms of war and foreign interventions, marginal differences domestically, but not any serious distinctions. And so I think we need to be careful about, again, devilizing other countries because they don't look like us. You know, I was born in West China. I grew up speaking Chinese on the island of Taiwan. By the time I was 18, I'd been in 40, 50 countries around the world, all over Asia, North Africa, Europe. And one of the things I've seen in my lifetime is that people are very different. Different languages, different cultures, different foods, different ways of relating, high context, low context. We Americans happen to be very low context. Russians happen to be very high context. Chinese are very high context. But whatever the government, can't we tolerate other governments? Do we have to threaten each other with nuclear weapons and the destruction of the earth? And that's why I think it's important to examine those of you who kind of hate Putin and think we've got to somehow change things over there in the Soviet Union. First of all, let those without sin cast the first stone. Secondly, in an increasingly turbulent world, it's not altogether clear what form of government is going to secure the polity in the most effective way. It may be that we have a lot to learn from China at a time when American democracy is completely broken and dysfunctional. So those of us who condemn Putin as being authoritarian, condemn the Russians, condemn other countries of the world, let us do so lightly, always knowing that when you point the finger at anybody, you've got three fingers pointing back. And I don't believe in our world today those kind of judgments are helpful, particularly when you're facing the prospect of nuclear war, if the conflict accelerates, and the larger issue of how we're going to deal with climate change. It doesn't matter to me what kind of government the Chinese or the Russians or the French or the Germans or the Indians or the Brazilians have. We got to deal with an escalating climate disaster on planet Earth, and it's all hands on deck. So I would call for tolerance among all of us and an embrace of enemies rather than deeper enmity if we're going to solve the issues confronting us. As Cherry is just saying, so many in our government are purchased by those that pay for their running their elections. Absolutely. 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 What do I think we have to learn from China? Well, first of all, the United States has endured for, I think it's 248 years. China has endured for 5,000. The United States has 330 million people. China has 1.4 billion people. And somehow the Chinese is the most populous country in the world for a very long time. Now apparently just superseded in the last few weeks by India. They've learned a lot about governance as a mechanism that ensures stability over time. And there's a lot that all of us can learn from that. Right now, the Chinese are in the grip of, I would say, a totalitarian regime. I personally believe it's unfortunate and unnecessary the way Xi Jinping has taken the Communist Party into all walks of life. But I think there's some deeper issues having to do with the durability of Chinese civilization and Chinese culture that are well worth contemplating. It's not my intent to defend or accuse. I learned a long time ago that that seldom is helpful. Every time I've criticized a person, I've almost always regretted it. Every time I've been aggressive against another person, I've almost always regretted it. It's always wise not to burn bridges. And so we all need to understand that most of what we think is true is delivered through the mass media. I mentioned yesterday that during the Soviet period, there was an analysis of the mass media on both sides, and they mirrored one another. Soviet Union, 98% of everything in the Soviet Union was hostile to the United States. 98% of everything broadcast in the United States on television and the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, all was negative about the Soviet Union. So as a result, the Soviets were hostile to the United States and the Americans are hostile, and that perpetuates the war machine. And I think that's a very fundamental point that we should take in. This is about the war machine, and that the cultivation of our perceptions as to who's the enemy is a function of the war machine. It's not the other way around. It's not that the Soviets were so evil, that's why we had nuclear weapons. It's because we had nuclear weapons that we needed an absolute enemy.
And the great tragedy of the post-Cold War era since 1989 is that the one country in the world that hasn't been able to give up that Cold War mentality, because we are now owned by the military-industrial complex, is the United States. Just imagine how different the world would be if the United States had embraced Gorbachev's proposal. I would be willing to bet money that China would be much more tolerant. But because we've been consistently hostile to China since 1949, it's a long time ago, the Chinese have been increasingly militaristic and aggressive. And to understand this, just go back to 9/11. The United States is attacked. What do we come up with as the Patriot Act? The war on terror and the militarization of US society. So when one feels under siege, when one feels under threat, whether it's the United States after 9/11, China after 1949, the Russians with the eastward expansion of NATO, you tend to become more authoritarian and less democratic just by the nature of things. That's just human nature. And at some point, as they did in Europe at the end of World War II with that Jean Monnet moment, you can change all that. That's the beauty of the human imagination. They went from war to peace like that and have had 75 years of prosperity until Ukraine. So I think this is probably a good place to close us out. I realize there's probably a lot of questions that people have and a lot of consternation that you feel because of what I've said. Remember, this has all been offered in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. This is one man's view, who happened to have a very intimate relationship and a loving relationship with the Russians. So I do love the Russians and I do love Russia. And I consider one of the greatest moments of my life and experiences of my life working with the Russians during those years of citizen diplomacy. And I long for that same camaraderie to burst forth anew at this critical moment of danger. So thank you, everyone. We'll be dealing now with other issues. Tomorrow, we'll be embarking on the meta issue of apology. I've said that I believe the United States needs to apologize to the world for what it's done since 1989. And I mean that sincerely. And I believe that we need to really explore deeply the issue of apology. And so starting tomorrow for the next 10 days, we're just going to immerse ourselves into what apology is all about. And we're going to be hearing from Native Americans, from American Black males, from people of color who've experienced the boot of colonialism and militarization. And we'll also be dealing with other issues as we move forward. But this is going to be a deep year because I think the danger the world is in is far greater than even the pandemic. We can move forward beyond viruses. We're not going to move forward in any meaningful way beyond nuclear war. And if we don't stop Ukraine, that's what we're going to get. So we need a ceasefire, and we need a summit, and we need peace in our time. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for honoring my passion about these matters. And we'll see you tomorrow. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the chat in the link that Stan
just put up. It's an opportunity for informal dialogue about these matters and other issues of grave concern. Bye for now.